Although for the foreign powers the war was limited, for the Spanish it was a total war as well as a civil war. Propaganda was used on both sides to dehumanize the enemy, even though the enemy was from the same country. Atrocities were common. Meanwhile, the targeting of civilians and bombing raids symbolized in the attack on Guernica offered a chilling premonition of what was to come in World War II. There were no lines drawn between civilian and combatant. One of the key questions that is still debated today is why did civil war break out? The extent to which the left or the right was more responsible for the abandonment of democracy chiefly characterized early accounts about the causes of the Spanish Civil War. Naturally, pro-nationalist interpretations, such as those written in the 1960s, blame the left. They emphasized left-wing lawlessness, such as the Asturian Uprising and growth of militant unionism, which forced the right to take decisive action to safeguard order, property, law, and religion against the specter of social revolution. Nationalist accounts emphasize the importance of the anti-church reforms of the left-wing republic leading to the Civil War. These accounts accorded with nationalist wartime propaganda that presented the Civil War as a crusade in which the conservative right fought to preserve traditional Christian values against a godless left-wing republic. While it was certainly the case that religion had the power to mobilize and inflame opinion, its importance may have been exaggerated by the conservative right, who wanted to present the Civil War as a religious crusade instead of a battle to preserve wealth and privilege. Overall, it is difficult to determine what extent religious conviction contributed to the outbreak of war. Pro-Republican interpretations stress that it was the extreme right who decisively went against the democratic system in launching the military uprisings in 1936. They also question the extent to which the conservative right had ever really supported the Democratic Republic. They presented examples of the Phalange youth group and the autocratic CEDA, whose commitment to democracy had always been doubted by their opponents. Accounts written by other historians have tended to emphasize the socioeconomic roots of the conflict. In particular, they highlight the difficulties caused by the long-term agrarian problems. Paul Preston is one of these historians. He sees this as the agrarian issues at the root of much of the conflict. Agrarian problems increase the growth of left-wing strikes and militancy and influence social reform programs of the left-wing governments, both of which antagonized the conservative right and played a key role in causing fractions in the left-wing coalitions. Ultimately, if the war was most profoundly rooted in social and political divisions caused by agrarian problems, it was also a war of multiple conflicts, with separatism, religion, and political factors all playing a key role and continuously dividing the population. In conclusion of the causes, extremism was a major reason for the cause of the Civil War. Neither side could fix the deep problems within Spain, so either they were going too far or they weren't moving quick enough. Democracy failed to keep war away, and throughout this conflict, they're going to use conventional warfare, and much of it will be fought on the backs of the civilians. The right-wing military uprising against the Republican government quickly developed into civil war. The forces of the conservative right were known as the Nationalists, while those who fought to defend the left-wing Republican government were the Republicans. The Civil War quickly acquired an important international dimension, with both sides reliant on foreign supplies of weapons. Ultimately, the nationalists triumphed, leading to the establishment of a right-wing military dictatorship. The role of strategy, tactics, technology, and the effective management of material requirements of war were all important in determining the outcome. Thus, the coup overall was unsuccessful, and had it remained a Spanish affair, it is quite possible that the Republicans would have won. This is a quote from one of your authors, and what they're stating here is that foreign intervention into the Spanish Civil War was one of the key reasons why the fascists will win. So here's a map of Spain right after Franco and the Africanistas invade. You can see they got some key areas. The nationalists are our territory right here. I mean, this is a very important region for mining. They have access to the sea right here, but yet they fail to take the capital and the industrial heartland, which is right here. So they do not, so initially this is not really successful. This is actually not successful at all, but here too, they managed to get some gains, and this is where all the food supplies are. So there we go. With the assistance of Nazi Germany, General Franco airlifted 24,000 experienced troops of the Army of Africa to Spain. It was the fact that Hitler responded to Franco's pleas for help that kept Franco's efforts alive. Once on the Spanish mainland, he used a policy of terror as his forces moved towards Madrid in August. Franco's success was complemented by the achievements of General Mola, who took territory in the north. The army coup had aimed to crush the left revolution, but had instead radicalized many Spaniards towards the left. The supporters of the Republican regime of 1936 became known as the Loyalists, and those that supported the rebels called themselves the Nationalists. Although the Nationalists made gains in the first weeks of the war, the Republic retained some advantages. It remained in control of most major cities and key industrial areas. It had Spain's gold reserves and important elements of the military. Most of the Air Force and Navy remained loyal. Yet, as you can see, many things will change over time, and Nationalists were able to make steady progress in pushing back the Republic. Divisions could generally be drawn by class. The workers supported the Republic, and the middle and upper classes tended to support the Nationalists. The Nationalists also had support of much of the church. However, alliances could be accidental, depending on where they were when the war developed. For instance, the peasants of the north and central Spain tended to be Nationalists, while the landless laborers of the south followed the Republicans. The Basques and Catalans supported the Republic, as it had backed their autonomous ambitions. The revolt of the military garrisons throughout Spain led rapidly to the division of Spain into nationalist and Republican areas. The Nationalists controlled the agricultural north and west, except the most northerly regions of the Basque Country and the Asturias, with its mining and industrial resources. Their area of western control bordered Portugal, whose dictator was sympathetic to them. The Nationalists also held a small segment of territory in southern Spain around Sevilla, where 1,500 troops from the Spanish Army of Africa were airlifted by Germany from Spanish Morocco to bolster Nationalist forces in July of 1936. More troops followed, ferried in convoys, in cooperation with Italian and German militaries. This army was to prove decisive in the fortunes of the military rebels and was led by General Francisco Franco, who emerged in September of 1936 as the leader of the Nationalists. As the war began, the Republicans were in a good spot. They controlled the major cities and industries. They had the loyalty of the small Navy and Air Force, as well as enlisted men from the Army. But they were slow to act and inexperienced militarily. And because the Liberals made a coalition with the Communists, they were going to have a hard time finding help from the West. In September 1936, at the fortress of Alcazar, this was a castle south of Madrid, 2,000 Nationalists were in the castle and currently surrounded by Republican troops. General Franco, whose troops were besieging Madrid, actually stopped and pulled his troops back to go to the fortress in order to relieve the nationalists. As a result, Madrid was able to have time to shore up their defenses, and they were able to receive that aid from the Soviet Union by October. And as a result of that, Franco will not be able to take Madrid. Republican fighters in Madrid were helped by the arrival of weapons from the USSR in Mexico on October 4th. These included Soviet tanks and aircraft, which proved superior to the German and Italian aircraft available at that stage to the nationalists. Republicans also had advantage in manpower with regular troops, militiamen, and the non-Spanish international brigades who arrived on November 8th, providing an additional 3,500 men for the defense of Madrid. By the end of November, a stalemate had set in to the west of Madrid. The Nationalists made significant territorial gains in 1937, which would prove a decisive year in the conflict. By the end of the year, Nationalists controlled 2/3 of the country, and the ability of the Republic to win the war was in serious doubt. Nationalists attempted to extend their control over southern Spain in early 1937 with a campaign focused on gaining the southern coastal city of Malaga, which was surrounded by nationalist troops. Nationalists were joined by 10,000 Italian troops in a coordinated attack on the city. The Italians employed their rapid war tactics, which relied on speed through the use of armored vehicles and tanks supported by aircraft. Weakened Republicans cut off in Malaga with only 12,000 militiamen and 16 artillery units were defeated by February 8, 1937. A new series of nationalist attempts to encircle and subdue Madrid were launched from January 1937. These included an attack on Guadalajara, northeast of the city, in March. The Guadalajara campaign aimed to take Madrid from the city's northeast. Like previous attempts to capture Madrid, infantry was supported by limited numbers of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Guadalajara, like previous nationalist campaigns around Madrid, resulted in a defensive victory for the Republicans. Republicans benefited from greater manpower and superior quality, although not quantity, of weaponry at this stage of the war, such as Soviet tanks. The nationalist advance was halted, and a stalemate once again prevailed around Madrid. The reported failure of nationalists to take Madrid precipitated a change in strategic focus. Franco shifted his attention to northern Spain, notably the far northern regions of the Basque Country and the Asturias, which remained outside of nationalist control. Franco calculated that these would be easier to take than Madrid, and their valuable resources and industries would add to nationalist strength. My dog agrees. Nationalist use of air power was crucial in this campaign. Nationalists achieved air supremacy through support of the German Condor Legion. From 1937, this included increased numbers of newly developed aircraft, which proved superior to those of the Republicans. The Vizcaya campaign began with aerial bombing raids on the cities in the north, which were devastated in March of 1937, with hundreds of civilians killed. Shortly afterwards, nationalist troops occupied the towns, encountering little resistance. Guernica was a provincial Basque town with a population of 7,000. It was of limited military significance, containing an armaments factory and occupying one of the main routes to the north. On April 26, 1937, it was targeted by Italian and German bomber and fighter aircraft. Bombs released 27,000 kilograms of incendiary bombs, while German fighters strafed the roads full of fleeing civilians. Guernica was left devastated. Over 1,500 people were killed, with many more wounded. The bombing of Guernica was one of the first significant examples of the deliberate targeting of primarily civilian area and the devastation that could be wrought by aerial bombs. This destruction was widely exploited in Republican propaganda within Spain and abroad. 3 days after the bombings, nationalist ground troops, facing very little resistance, captured Guernica. Rapid progress made by nationalists through the Basque region culminated in their assault on the regional capital, the highly industrialized Bilbao. Nationalists breached the city's fortress defenses following heavy artillery and aerial bombardment, while also blockading by the sea, which starved the city of supplies. Bilbao surrendered on June 19, 1937. Conquest to the north was completed by October 1937. The success of the nationalist advance was primarily the result of nationalist air superiority with enormously aided advancing infantry. This map was produced as propaganda and used to kind of scare France, especially into helping to aid the Republic right here, which would be this light colored. And here, this was what they're saying was rebel Spain. These are the nationalists. And what it's saying is, hey, France, if you don't help us out, you're going to be surrounded by a fascist government here, fascist government here, fascist government here. And guess who's coming for you? And so it was kind of used to drum up support. And actually, it kind of worked. With national forces making considerable advances in northern Spain during the summer of 1937, Republicans launched their first major offensive of the war at Brunete, east of Madrid. The objective was to help relieve Madrid's siege. Initial Republican maneuvers, in which infantry were supported by artillery, tanks, and aircraft, were in the main successful. Brunete was captured in 2 days. Republicans, however, quickly ran into problems. Many of the tanks used to support the infantry were halted by anti-tank weapons. Republicans, who lost their dominance of the skies following the arrival of German fighters and bombers from the Condor Legion. Republican troops were subjected to air attack and communications broke down, making it difficult to coordinate a renewed offensive. Republicans consequently entrenched themselves, but this failed to protect them from air attack. The Nationalists counterattacked and regained Brunete soon afterwards. By the beginning of 1938, the majority of Spain was under nationalist control, with the exception of Madrid, the southeast, and Catalonia. The Nationalist Army, now numbered 600,000, was a third larger than that of the Republicans. Nationalist troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, launched an offensive into Catalonia, taking only 6 weeks to cut through Catalonia to reach the Mediterranean Sea. The Republicans sought to halt this advance with a counterattack at the Abreu River. The strategic aim of the Republicans' Abreu offensive was to force the Nationalists to divert troops north and away from Valencia in Catalonia. It was part of Prime Minister Juan Negrin's strategic objective to prolong the war. He believed that a general European war would soon break out between fascist and democratic states, into which the Spanish conflict would be subsumed. In such a war, he hoped that Britain and France would not help the Republicans, partly for fear of provoking the outbreak of a broader conflict, might be more amenable to lending assistance to the Republic, or at least that Germany and Italy would lessen aid to Franco, as this would be needed to defend their own immediate interests. At any rate, the Spanish conflict would become part of a wider conflict between fascism and democracy, which Negrin believed the democratic states would win. The initial Republican advance across the Abreu River into nationalist territory progressed rapidly, and within a week they had gained nearly 40 kilomiles. The advance demonstrated improvements in organization and discipline of the Popular Army, although the tactical use of tanks in particular continued to be poor. It soon became apparent that Republicans could not sustain the momentum of advance as their troops were slowed by strong nationalist resistance that was aided enormously by aircraft. Republican troops were also pushed back over the next 3.5 months until by November 16th, they had lost all the territory they had gained. In retreat, the Popular Army maintained its discipline and organization to a greater extent than it had previously. But the loss of 75,000 troops killed, missing, or wounded, as well as huge amounts of equipment, meant that Negrin's hopes of prolonging the conflict was unrealistic. By the beginning of 1939, the war effectively was won by the Nationalists. Despite the key cities of Barcelona and Madrid remaining Republican, these cities soon fell to the Nationalists. Nationalists encountered relatively little resistance in their assault on Barcelona. 2 million people in the city were cut off from what remained of Republican Spain and demoralized by food shortages and relentless aerial bombardment. Nationalists occupied the city on January 26, almost without a fight. After the fall of Barcelona, Republican resistance rapidly dissipated. The president resigned and went into exile on February 6th. An even more devastating blow came on February 27th when the British and French governments recognized Franco as the legitimate head of the Spanish government. With only 500,000 Republican troops remaining within the Republican zone, Negrin's strategy of prolonging the war was futile. Politicians and military leaders who opposed Negrin's strategy and his communist-dominated government rebelled in Madrid on March 5, 1939. The rebels established an anti-communist junta called the National Defense Council, which attempted to open negotiations with Franco for a conditional surrender. Another internal civil conflict broke out within the Republican zone, leaving nearly 230 dead and almost 600 wounded. Negrin fled to France. Franco was not interested in overtures for conditional surrender and occupied Madrid on March 27th. Spain was finally fully under nationalist control. Some historians have argued that foreign aid was a crucial factor in the nationalist victory over the Republic. Hugh Thomas writes in his 1961 book, The Spanish Civil War, that the conflict became an international crisis whose solution was decided by external circumstances. Indeed, the rebels benefited from more aid, which was of better quality than that given to the Republicans, and its supply was continuous throughout the war. But the key benefit for the nationalists was not the manpower, as most of the armies were Spanish. It was the modern equipment they received from Germany and Italy.